Welcome to Close Up Radio, where our hosts, Doug Llewellyn and Jim Masters, bring you the amazing stories of people who answered the call to unlock their potential and taken control of their own success with authenticity, creativity, persistence, and resilience. Close Up Radio special guests share their knowledge and wisdom so you, the listener, can live the most empowered life possible. Close Up Radio. And now, here's today's host, Jim Masters.
Thanks very much for joining us, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. We're live on Close Up Radio. It's Monday, November 1st, kicking off the month, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, kicking off the month here on Close Up Radio with recovery coach Dr. Bob Weathers. He was with me last week. We had a fantastic conversation, so much so we wanted to continue and share more with you. He's a recovery coach who understands addiction from the inside, and if you heard last week's show, you know exactly his story. If you didn't, definitely go back into part one. We really tackled some incredible conversations, but briefly, prior to becoming a recovery coach, Dr. Weathers was a highly regarded professor of psychology. But, of course, for him, he eventually descended into increasing midlife addiction, alcohol, other things that came along for about 15 years, finally losing the tenured academic position, which we talked about. But then again, you know, he had several aha and epiphany moments. You know, one would think having lost everything of value would get his attention, but, of course, how often happens is addiction gets worse. When he finally awoke from that bad dream, he realized he needed to change radically. And like a phoenix rising from the ashes, he gradually got his life back. Not necessarily easy, but he stuck with it and he worked towards it. And everybody else, including Dr. Weathers, has benefited from that result. He says people have different destinies. Seems like he just had to endure some extremely painful learning lessons to be able to get where he is today. And oftentimes that is the case. Sometimes you have to take those 2 steps backwards to go 3 steps forward, they say. And there is truth to that. Sometimes no pain, no gain. Upon his recovery, he wondered if there was a way he could apply, you know, that clinical background in psychology to help others recovering from addictions or any kind of issues at any time in life, young or old. And today, as a recovery coach and addiction educator, he works with professionals of all types. Many of his clients are successful lawyers, doctors, business executives, people who no one would ever expect to be struggling with addiction. But they do. Everybody does from time to time. So things happen, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. And we're going to talk about that because, you know, oftentimes people feel ashamed, secretive, don't tell the neighbors, I have no faults, I can't be vulnerable, can't show any weakness. And that can really spiral downward even further. Shame is a public enemy to a lot of people in terms of mental health. If a person doesn't conquer shame, they won't make forward progress in the recovery, according to Dr. Weathers. So he works with clients to navigate the shame of their addiction with self-compassion. Oftentimes, you might want to get out of the addiction, but the shame of people finding out you even have an addiction can keep you locked in it. To explore this deeply and more, we welcome Dr. Bob Weathers back to our show from Newport Coast, California. Dr. Weathers, welcome back for part 2 of our series together here on Close Up Radio. It's a pleasure to have you here and to kick off a new week together.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you, Jim. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. You know, I was mentioning shame can be very, very claustrophobic, and it keeps us locked in place sometimes where the shame almost sometimes equals the strength of the addiction and keeps us addicted into whatever it is we're addicted to because we're afraid, supposedly, of sharing the shame with the world. But when you do, the world wants to help. People like you want to help. You're there. You've lived through it yourself. You know exactly how that feels. You can relate as you do to your clients. Shame oftentimes, again, is not something that we really should allow rule us, and there's nothing, you know, shameful about it. It's life, things happen. Now let's work through this together, right?
That's right. I wonder if I might say a word about shame, Jim. Is that okay?
Oh, that's exactly perfect. That's what. Yeah, I think people. It can be overpowering for people.
Yeah. Let me maybe begin, Jim, by just giving a little bit of backdrop in terms of defining shame and talking about how it has come to be public enemy number one, not only in terms of addiction, but also generally in terms of mental health. Some of our audience will have read about it, but maybe many haven't. So let me just provide a little bit of an orientation. First of all, if we just define shame in common sense words like self-judgment, especially when it's relentless, that turns into self-condemnation, the kind of attitude that somehow I'm a failure, that there's no hope for me, that's shame. And maybe not surprisingly, it's the most stressful negative human emotion. The way that biologists measure stress in our emotions is they look at, there are two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, and they measure the elevation in those two stress hormones around different emotions, and shame is the highest. So what I just described as self-condemnation, it spikes our cortisol and our adrenaline more highly than even anger or sadness or fear. It's the most stressful human emotion. It makes sense, if you think about it, Jim, why that would be the case, why Mother Nature would wire us that shame would be the most stressful. In other words, it's the red alert that gets our attention. And that is because shame is fear of being kicked out of our social network. And that's the biology of it. And we are inherently wired to be social animals. And it's not so far back in human evolution that we were utterly reliant for safety to be embedded in a community. So to be kicked out of the community was to become prey to predators that would eat us for lunch. And so you need to have something inside of you that lets you know that you're blowing it and blowing it badly, else you would be, that'd be the end of your hereditary line. So shame gets our attention in a big way. I want to say another word about the biology, if I can, Jim, and that is, I mentioned, I'm going to use cortisol as shorthand for cortisol and adrenaline, is that when cortisol goes up in the body and the brain, so that's a stress hormone, we can't sustain that. It's corrosive over the long haul. It's very helpful to motivate us to run, to move into action, and that's what cortisol does. It activates us. But it's very, like I say, it actually breaks us down if it's allowed to circulate for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, you cannot barbecue in your own adrenaline. And what she was talking about was shame, and she knew this from a medical perspective. And so what happens when we're encountering shame, especially chronic shame, is we're operating with elevated cortisol. If you can imagine a seesaw on the children's playground, is that if cortisol goes up, you want it to go down. Well, what will send it down on the other end of the seesaw is another brain chemical, and that's called dopamine. And so anytime I can get a dopamine elevation, a dopamine spike, it sends cortisol down. They're equal and opposite, just like a seesaw. And so this is where the plot thickens, because virtually every addictive behavior, whether it be to substance like alcohol and other drugs, or any of the other behavioral addictions, whether it's gambling or porn or obsessive gaming, spending, we can go down the list of all the different things that enslave us. And by the way, that's the root meaning of the word addiction. It comes from the Latin word addictus, which simply means slave. And so whatever keeps us in servitude, whether it be to a substance or a behavior, it's because what we're seeking is dopamine elevation. What's in common across all addictions is a dopamine spike, and the good news is short term, the cortisol goes down, the shame goes down, the stress goes down. The bad news is that the body cannot tolerate too much dopamine. So any guess what the body kicks in when dopamine goes up? I'll tell you, it kicks in cortisol to rebalance it. So you get in this oscillating spiral between elevations in stress and then elevations in dopamine. The body kicks in the stress hormones, to lower the dopamine. And that's really the biology in a nutshell of withdrawal, the withdrawal that we experience from anything that we're addicted to. There were some interesting studies done some years ago, here actually in California, where a hospital system wanted to look at various predictors of adult health issues. They were looking at coronary issues, pulmonary, cancer risk, those kinds of things. And they were looking at psychological factors that correlate with these various biological diseases. They threw into this study addictive disorders. They wanted just to see what kinds of things lead us to be more vulnerable to addiction. And this ties back again to the whole stress and the whole shame cycle. What they found, Jim, is that people that grow up in what they call adverse childhood experiences and well above normal, and so to put this in English, this would be childhood trauma, neglect, abandonment of any kind, is highly correlated with addiction in adulthood. Well, the biological math on this, Jim, is not too complicated, because the fact is that if somebody has grown up in above average levels of trauma, neglect, abandonment in the household, whatever the household situation was, they'll move into adulthood with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times the level of baseline stress of anybody else that you'd see walking down the street. They're doing what my client talked about. They're walking around barbecuing in their own adrenaline. And if my client, the nurse, is right, and she is, that we cannot tolerate that long term, then you know that that person is going to seek to lower the cortisol that they're barbecuing in any way they can. That leads them to dopamine-enhancing behaviors, all of which are addictive. So that's the math in a nutshell. I'll stop there and breathe for a second and see how this lands for you. I can say more, but I wanted to orient this. Shame is the most stressful human emotion. The biology of stress is increased cortisol. The way that you reduce stress, the way you reduce cortisol, the way you reduce shame, for many people, is to increase dopamine. And for most people, this lands them in the realm of addiction to substances or behaviors. And there's more to say about that, but that at least gives you a little bit of an orientation to how it is that shame is public enemy number one. If we don't lick shame in terms of its the stress, it's going to make us incredibly vulnerable either to beginning an addiction or relapsing to addiction. It has to be addressed. You've got to do the surgery, like with a scalpel. You have to go deep enough to get out the infection. If you just keep treating the symptoms, the person will relapse. The person will be vulnerable to addiction.
So let's talk a little bit about how you work with your clients to really take that first step to deal with shame, to deal with these issues in our life. What is do you tread lightly? Do you lower your voice and start whispering? I mean, how do you approach it when you see that is one of the number one things that's halting that person in place? It's a great question. Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. One is why I want to address what's being done and has been done for nearly 100 years now in self-help support groups, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And then I want to get to the soft voice that you talked about, working individually with clients. And I really think that these two, group interventions and individual support interventions, they work hand in hand. So if we think about this, what we have to do, I've actually coined this word myself. It's the word I use with clients in the groups I lead. We need to unshame addiction. And if we succeed in that, what we do is we free up resources. If we fail in that, if shame continues to rule the day, you end up with what shame is, which is a freeze response in the body and the brain, and the person will be stuck. They will not be able to make forward progress. So it's absolutely essential that you remove the boulder in the stream, and that boulder is shame. And so I think this is the genius, honestly, Jim, of 12-step and other self-help support programs, where you're not only supported in expressing things that feel shameful to you. Carl Jung, the eminent psychiatrist, called it the personal shadow. You're not only encouraged
to share this in safe groups where there's no judgment. You're actually required. It's the requirement if you're going to be in a 12-step support group or any other self-help support group. I personally have been in 12-step support as well as refuge recovery, which is a more mindfulness-based orientation to recovery, as well as integral recovery, which is a holistic approach. And all of them have this in common, is the conversations are you're finding a safe environment where there's no stigma, there's no judgment. And so I think that's critical, is that you have some place to go that's safe. The issue is that there's so much judgment. In fact, there was a study done some years ago at Johns Hopkins University. Their School of Public Health is the best school of public health on the planet. And they studied, here in the U.S., they studied stigma, which is just social judgment. They studied stigma around addiction. They presented to subjects in their study a whole list of all the possible disorders you can have in the diagnostic manual for psychopathology, which comes out of psychiatry and psychology. And so this is everything from depressions to anxieties to personality disorders. Well, they included substance use disorders in this study. That's the technical term for addiction. And probably no surprise here, Jim, but addiction was at the very bottom of the list in terms of having the most negative social judgment. And so that stigma keeps most of us, it's where we started, keeps most of us trapped in silence. We don't want to share it because it's too humiliating, it's too vulnerable. We can't possibly risk that. Well, the way to move through any kind of fear is to face it. And so this is the good thing about self-help support groups, is that they provide an opportunity. And I'll speak firsthand, Jim. I've always been modest by nature. You might not know this about me since we've met in this context, but I've always been modest, and I've been aware of it, about sharing my shadow, sharing my faults. And so you can imagine what a nightmare it was for me to get into recovery and to have to go to my therapist as well as the 12-step support groups and other support groups. I mentioned refuge recovery and integral recovery, and basically out myself for the darkest things imaginable, which have to do with my addiction. It was so painful to me. My sponsor used to sit next to me in one of the 12-step meetings that I went to several days a week, and he elbowed me and says, "You have to share, Bob. Every meeting I went to, I shared." And you know what? Over time, I got to where I could do that, so much so that this past Saturday, I presented at a statewide conference here in California on addiction. I presented there a workshop on Saturday afternoon, and I was completely transparent with my story. And when I tell you that, I get chills on my arms, because I can't imagine doing that 10 years ago. I'm not sure I can imagine doing that 5 years ago. And I'm completely open about it now. So you know that it requires working through shame to be able to be completely honest, transparent, without contraction. And I was able to achieve that. I'm not going to pretend to you that I wasn't sweating blood before this, because this would be the first conference I've spoken to in 2 years live because of COVID. And it'll only be the fourth conference that I've ever presented on addiction at. And I wanted to be even more transparent than I had been in the previous three, and I was. And it worked. It worked. I'm really grateful for that. Yeah, let me mention one other piece too, and that has to do with you're asking about, do I speak in a gentler tone of voice? I meet with clients individually in the work I do. These days, it's all online, but I do encourage clients in the gentlest way possible to practice skills. I think it requires building muscles, just like self-disclosing requires muscles. I think it requires muscles, so to speak, to develop self-compassion. And so, for example, I've developed a forgiveness practice, and I've got a CD out on forgiveness practice. That the essence of it is practicing every day until you can develop authentic self-compassion about the darkest recesses of your own history. And I practice this every day. I did this morning. I go swimming every morning in a local community pool, and I practice forgiveness practice every morning. And after having done this every morning for 10 years, I'm about 90% free of shame, which is to say, on Saturday, I was sweating blood before this conference. So I'm still vulnerable to it. I'm not saying I'm invulnerable, but the reality is I have the guts to do it now, and I have the strength, and then I can celebrate afterwards because that actually adds another layer of strength for me. So I help clients develop self-compassion. I also help clients with something I'm working on right now, a CD I'm working on, which is on gratitude, beginning to find ways of expressing gratitude for our lives, which ties in with what you and I talked about in our first meeting, which is it even applies to gratitude for what it is that got me to this place, which, sad to say, but seemingly it was required me to be addicted so that I could recover. And I'm grateful to be on this side of all of that for sure. And as I shared with you last week, I don't take for granted all of those who went through that with me and had my back. My wife, Colleen, my daughter, Amanda, my daughter's mother, Tammy, about a dozen close friends. They had I'm going to start crying here in a second. They had my back. Well, I express gratitude for this group every single morning. And so I help clients to do that so that they can develop a sense of familiarity with both self-compassion but also gratitude, including gratitude for everything that's got them to where they are right now, which for most of my clients has to do with recovery, where they've actually gotten their lives back again. So those are some of the skills that we work on individually, all of which address this thing of shame.
That's absolutely incredible. That's really, thanks for sharing that, Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks for receiving it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really think that shame enslaves us. For that matter, I think ignorance does. And so I'm hell-bent on providing information not only to clients and their family members, but like this weekend, I was presenting to mental health professionals and recovery workers. I'm interested in the piece I just provided on the biology of shame and how that relates to addiction around dopamine and cortisol. I want every client that I work with to get to where they can articulate that, first of all, to themselves, and then to the significant people in their lives. I want them to be able to talk just like I do. And I work hard at that. So I think that ignorance freezes us or enslaves us. I think that good information liberates us. So I'm all for liberating our best resources.
Yes, that's really, really important. It's all part of the growth process. The whole goal is to really grow and learn from these experiences. Your daughter, Amanda, gives you so much inspiration. And we talked a little bit about that book that you wrote together. That alone is extraordinary. I wonder, if in the height of the addiction, if you could ever thought it would be a full circle situation and would result in such a beautiful thing as that, huh?
Yeah. I want to respond to you around this, and it really is sacred to me. I know this from talking to Amanda over the years, and I've told this to clients and groups, that Amanda went through this with me. Her mother, Tammy, went through this with me. She was incredibly supportive. My wife, Colleen, never flagged, was just supportive. And I mentioned a dozen closest friends, Jim and Don and Simon and Kevin. The list just goes on, people that have really been with me through this. And I'm really happy to name them. Guy in South Africa. I mean, just people that have really made all the difference. But if Amanda were to walk in right now, and she probably will listen to this radio interview later, and you were to ask her what she thinks about me. When I was in the depths of my addiction and actually early in recovery, I felt like I had failed her, and I really saw myself through the eyes of shame. I was 90% shamed then, and I'm probably about 10% right now. But if you asked Amanda now what she would say about me, she wouldn't say what I was so fearful of. In fact, I know this. Amanda would say that when my daddy gets knocked down, he gets up. Mm-hmm. And that means the world to me, because Amanda now knows that it's possible when she faces challenges that she's got it in her too, and I've been able to model that. And somewhat ironically, she's been part of what helped me to model it for her, is her belief in me. The same with Colleen. If you were to ask my wife, I know this because she said it to me. She says, Bobby, she calls me Bobby. She says, Bobby, you've taught me how to truly love. Well, do you remember last week when I shared that poem with you by Naomi Shihab Nye, where she says, what does it say? She says, before you know kindness is the deepest thing inside. Might as well substitute love for that. Before you know love as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. And when Colleen says what she says to me, or when Amanda says what she says to me, whatever resilience that I have inside of me, whatever love I have inside of me that comes through is completely a function of having gone through the dark night of the soul with them by my side. I'm eternally grateful to them. So absolutely. So for Amanda and I to come full circle and have written this book together, which is my poetry and her art and my music, and to do that together is an incredible experience. I mean, it's just so healing. I think there's two things that have been most healing for me in my own recovery process, and both of them are represented there. One is connection. I've already talked about that. I recommend everybody to see the fantastic TED Talk by Johann Hari. It's called Everything That, what is it? I got to think about it for a second. I think everything you ever heard about addiction is wrong. That'll get your attention. This video has been seen by millions. It's viral. And at the very end, Johann Hari, who I have such respect for, says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Mm-hmm. And so whether it's Amanda or Colleen or Amanda's mother Tammy or friends of mine, it's connection that has saved me. And the second part is also part and parcel of the book with Amanda, which it has to do with personal creativity. Amanda and I have created out of nothing. We've created out of our own souls, basically, what it is that's come up and brought together creative product in terms of music and poetry and her art and so on. And I really think that the goal of recovery, in fact, Jim, I had a client in one of the groups a couple of years back that said, Dr. Weathers, he said, calling it recovery is a misnomer. And I said, well, say more. I can still picture him as clear as a bell. He said, they shouldn't call it recovery. They should call it discovery. And what he meant by that is that he was discovering for the first time. It wasn't like he was recovering something he had lost because he had gotten addicted so young, as so many of our clients have. He was discovering for the first time who he is, what he wanted to do to contribute in the short time that we have on this planet. And that's all about personal creativity. It's all about personal creativity of locating what is your unique signature and then offering that to the world. And I think Amanda's and my project together, I know that it's the fruit of that combination of connection, which I have so profoundly with her, and creativity, both of which have saved me and can save others. Yeah.
I want them to know where they can find the book. The title is Reflections for Three, a Father, His Daughter, and You, co-authored with his daughter, Amanda. It's available in paperback and Kindle formats on Amazon. Again, Reflections for Three, a Father, His Daughter, and You, available on Amazon, paperback and Kindle formats. And if you'd like to connect with our very special guest, Dr. Bob Weathers, just go to the website. It's very easy. It's www.doctor, and that's the abbreviation, that's DR, Dr. Bob Weathers, WEATHERS.com, drbobweathers.com. Dr. Weathers, this was really another insightful, thought-provoking, and very powerful conversation here on Close Up Radio. Always a privilege and a pleasure to chat with you. Always connecting and learning so much, and also being inspired along the way as well. Thanks for joining us. It goes by way too fast.
Thank you too, Jim. It's such an honor and a pleasure to interact with you. I'll be back again, I hope soon.
Yes, and we definitely look forward to it. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for sharing the raw emotion as well. It just shows that you're real and you have feelings, and you have such a deep desire to work with people and help people, and that's a very beautiful thing. So, Dr. Weathers, thanks so much for joining us on the show. And everybody listening, we hope you were moved by this conversation. DrBobWeathers.com is, again, the website, and you can find the book at Amazon. This is your host, Jim Masters, thanking you for your time this time till next time. Stay tuned. Back momentarily with another amazing guest on Close Up Radio. Till then, for all of us, have a terrific day. Bye for now.